The rule about not going out after 2 was already in place when I transferred to the Powder River District in the spring of 2022. Nobody called it a rule. It wasn't written anywhere I could find. The phrase people used was a standing practice, which in the Forest Service usually means something that started as someone's preference and became policy through repetition. I heard it first from Colleen Hargrove, the district recreation technician, during my second week. We were in the break room at the Buffalo office, and she was explaining which trails got the most overnight use in July. If you're on the east side and something comes in after 2, you hold and reassess at first light, she said. I asked her to clarify. 2 a.m., she said. You don't go in after 2. I waited for the rest of the explanation. She was already rinsing her mug. In the context of search and rescue on Forest Service land, the county sheriff holds authority. In Sheridan County, in Johnson County, in Washakie County, the sheriff's office runs SAR. We assist. We provide access knowledge, trail conditions, sometimes a vehicle or a body. But the decision to launch belongs to the sheriff. And when the call comes in at 11 p.m. that a hiker hasn't returned from a day trip above Misty Moon Lake, the sheriff's volunteer team rolls and we coordinate. That's standard everywhere I've worked. The 2 a.m. practice wasn't about legal authority. It was about whether Forest Service personnel, specifically rangers assigned to the Bighorn East Side trails, would physically enter the backcountry after a certain hour. I want to be precise about what this meant in practice, because people hear they never rescue anyone after 2 a.m. and imagine something dramatic. In reality, what it changed was small. Maybe 5 or 6 times a season, a call would come in late enough that the question became relevant. Usually it was an overdue hiker whose car was still at a trailhead. Sometimes a campsite report from someone who'd come out and said their friend was supposed to be right behind them. The sheriff's teams made their own decisions about deployment. What the standing practice meant for us was this. If the request for Forest Service assistance came in after 2, we staged at the trailhead and waited for dawn. We didn't go in. I had transferred from the Arapahoe Roosevelt in Colorado, where I'd spent 4 years on the Canyon Lakes District. Nobody there had a rule like that. We went when they called us. If a sheriff's team was heading up a drainage at 3 in the morning and wanted a ranger who knew the trail, someone went. So the Bighorn practice struck me as unusual, but I didn't make a thing of it. Every district has habits. Some of them are about liability. Some are about terrain. The Bighorn East Side, once you get above 8,000 feet, is steep country cirques and talus, and boulder fields that are genuinely dangerous to navigate at night with headlamps. I assumed the practice existed because someone had gotten hurt doing exactly that, and the district had quietly decided it wasn't worth the risk to personnel. I assumed this for about 14 months. If you're someone who follows accounts of strange incidents on public land, backcountry cases that don't resolve neatly, or the kind of professional experiences that change the way a person thinks about the places they're paid to manage, you might want to subscribe to Ashwarden Horror. The rest of this account is going to take a while. The Bighorn National Forest covers about 1.1 million acres across the spine of the Bighorn Range. The terrain rises from sagebrush and grass on the western side near Grable and Lovell, climbs through ponderosa stands into dense lodgepole and spruce fir forest at mid-elevation, and breaks into alpine tundra and bare granite above 10,000 feet. Cloud Peak sits at the center at just over 13,000 feet, with what's left of a glacier tucked into its east face. The east side, my side, the Powder River District, is defined by long drainages that cut down from the high country toward the plains around Buffalo and Sheridan. The creeks come down fast. The trails follow them for a while, then switch back up onto benches and eventually into the alpine. In summer, the lower trails are beautiful wildflowers, clear water, elk sign everywhere. Above timberline, the weather is its own jurisdiction. I've seen a cloudless July morning produce golf ball hail by 1 in the afternoon. The district office in Buffalo served 3 full-time rangers, 1 law enforcement officer, 2 seasonal wilderness rangers in the summer, and Colleen, who outlasted everyone. The forest supervisor sat in Sheridan. Our district ranger was a man named Paul Kessler, who'd been in the position 6 years and planned to retire from it. Paul was quiet, competent, and had that specific quality some long-tenured district rangers develop where they seem to know the forest the way a homeowner knows which floorboards creak. He was the one who'd know if a culvert on Forest Road 19 had shifted since snowmelt, or if the horse camp at Circle Park was getting boggy. I liked Paul. He was easy to work for. I asked Paul about the 2 a.m. practice in June of my first summer. He was in his truck and I was standing beside it in the parking lot, and he had that look people get when the question is slightly more complicated than they want to handle in a parking lot. He turned off the engine. "It's a safety call," he said. "Based on an incident?" "Based on conditions." "Which conditions?" Paul looked at the steering wheel for a moment. "The east side drainages above about 8,500 feet get complex at night. You know the terrain. It's the kind of country where a twisted ankle turns into a litter carry. And then the rescue needs a rescue. After a certain hour, the risk-benefit calculation changes." I said that made sense. "Good." He started the truck again, and I stepped back. The conversation had lasted maybe 45 seconds, and everything he said was defensible and reasonable. But the thing about Paul was that he chose words carefully, and what he'd just said was careful in a way that didn't match the question. I'd asked if the practice was based on an incident, and he hadn't said no. He'd redirected. It didn't matter. I had trails to patrol and campfire rings to inventory and wilderness registration cards to collect from the boxes at 7 trailheads. I was busy. The summer of 2022 was a heavy-use year. The forest had gotten attention from some travel websites, and the Hunter Creek and Solitude Loop trails were seeing more overnight traffic than the backcountry sites could absorb. I spent most of July walking those trails with a bear canister loaner in my pack and a stack of Leave No Trace cards, talking to people from Texas and Minnesota who wanted to know if the water was safe to drink straight from the creek. The answer is always filter it, but I understood the impulse. The water up there looks like something from a commercial. August came in hot at the lower elevations and cool in the high country, which is typical. The seasonal rangers, Jake Pruitt and Danny Montoya, were covering the west side trails out of Graybull. I was on the east side mostly alone, based out of Buffalo, doing 4- and 5-day patrols with overnight camps at established backcountry sites. I'd pack in on Monday, work the trail system for visitor contacts and compliance checks, camp at Sherd Lake or Emerald Lake or wherever the itinerary put me, and pack out Thursday or Friday. On the night of August 11th, a Thursday, I was camped at a site I'll call the Elbow, a flat bench about a quarter mile off the main trail where 2 forks of a creek come together at roughly 9,000 feet. It was a known campsite, lightly used because it required fording one of the forks, which ran thigh-deep during a normal August. I'd picked it because I wanted to check the fire ring for compliance and because I liked the spot. Spruce on 3 sides, the creek audible but not loud, good drainage. I was in my tent by 9:30, reading a paperback with my headlamp. The sky was clear, no wind. Temperature maybe 45 degrees, which was comfortable in a good bag. At some point, I became aware of a sound I couldn't immediately place. I turned off my headlamp and listened. The creek was there, steady, a constant wash of white noise I'd already tuned out. But underneath it, or beside it, there was something periodic. A rhythm that wasn't the water's rhythm. It rose and fell on an interval I estimated at 8 to 10 seconds. Not mechanical, there was variation, but consistent enough that once I'd noticed it, I couldn't stop tracking it. I unzipped the tent and sat in the vestibule. Stars were thick above the clearing. No moon yet. The sound was clearer outside, but I still couldn't locate it. It seemed to come from the drainage to the northwest upstream along the left fork, but sound behaves strangely in these narrow mountain valleys. It bounces off rock walls. I've been fooled before by echoes that placed a bugling elk a quarter-mile from where it actually stood. I put on my boots, grabbed my headlamp but didn't turn it on, and walked to the edge of the bench where I could see down to the water. The creek was a pale line in the starlight. The forest across the water was black. The sound was still there. If I had to describe it, I'd say it was closest to a low, resonant hum, like the drone of a large insect scaled up by a factor of 10, but slower, continuous, then fading, then returning. It didn't seem to be getting closer or farther. It was just there, occupying the drainage the way the creek noise occupied the drainage. Except I'd been at this site for 5 hours before I noticed it. I stood for maybe 10 minutes. Then I went back to the tent, noted the time, 11 to 14 p.m., and the observation in my field notebook, and went to sleep, or tried to. The sound persisted for another hour, maybe longer. I don't know when it stopped because I eventually slept through it. In the morning, I walked upstream along the left fork for about 20 minutes. Nothing unusual. The creek was running clear. Some elk tracks on the bank, a few days old based on the edge definition. I found a downed spruce across the channel that could conceivably have created an aeolian effect, wind passing over a gap in the root ball. But there'd been no wind the night before. I wrote it off. Sounds in the mountains are common, and most of them have explanations you'll never confirm because the conditions that produce them have already changed. I packed out that morning and drove back to Buffalo. I filed my patrol report, noting visitor contacts, fire ring conditions, one illegal campsite within 100 feet of water at Sherd Lake, and the nighttime sound at the elbow. I logged the sound under environmental observations and described it as an intermittent low-frequency hum of unknown origin, possibly aeolian, not associated with any visible source. Colleen read my report the following week. She read everyone's reports. She was technically a recreation tech, but she functioned as the district's institutional memory, the person who knew where every file was and what had been tried before. "You heard the hum," she said. She said it conversationally, the way you'd say, "You found the old trail register," or "You saw the moose at Circle Park," like it was a known feature of the landscape. "It's been reported before?" Tom Gately mentioned it twice. In 2017 and again in 2019, I think. Same general area. He wrote it up the same way you did. Tom Gately had been a ranger on the district before me. He'd transferred to the Shoshone in 2020. Anyone follow up? Colleen gave me a look that was hard to read. "It's a sound in the mountains, Aaron. It's in the file." She was right that there wasn't much to follow up on. A sound that two people heard on different nights, years apart, in the same drainage. Interesting, not actionable. The district didn't have resources to send someone up there with audio equipment to record ambient noise for a week. We barely had resources to keep the trail signs from falling over. I let it go. The rest of August was consumed by a fire that started on the west side near Ten Sleep and put everyone on suppression support for 10 days. By the time we returned to normal operations, the high country was starting to turn. Larch going gold, first frost on the alpine lakes, the backpackers replaced by the bow hunters. In September, I was assigned to assist with a planned trail reroute above Little Goose Creek, which meant 3 days of GPS work on a section where the old trail was eroding into the drainage. It was detailed, tedious work walking the proposed route, with a GPS unit flagging problem sections, measuring grade. I was on the second day, working alone on a bench at about 8,800 feet, when I found something off the trail that stopped me. It was a cairn. Not a trail cairn, the Forest Service doesn't use cairns on this section, and the trail was clearly marked with blazes. This was a deliberate stack of 5 flat stones, the largest about 10 inches across, built on a granite outcrop roughly 30 yards from the trail in a direction that led nowhere useful. No social trail, no campsite, no water source. Just the cairn on the rock, oriented in a way that made it easy to see from the trail if you were heading north. I walked to it. The stones were local granite, dry stacked, stable. Not fresh, there was lichen growth on the contact surfaces of the lower 3, which told me they'd been stacked for at least a few seasons, maybe longer. The top stone had a shallow depression in its center that held about a tablespoon of rainwater. I noted the GPS coordinates and photographed it. On its own, a cairn in the backcountry means nothing. People build them. It's a constant problem in wilderness areas, visitors stacking rocks for fun, marking routes that don't need marking, or just playing with stones. We knock them down when we find them, because they're technically a human installation in designated wilderness. But this one didn't look recreational. It was too well built, too deliberately placed, and too far from the trail to be a casual stack. It was the kind of thing someone built for a reason and expected to find again. I knocked it down. That was procedure. But I kept the coordinates. 2 weeks later, I was back on the same trail for the reroute survey, and I found a second cairn. This one was about 1.5 miles north of the first. Same elevation, same distance off trail to the west. Same construction, 5 flat stones, stable, lichened. Same orientation, easily visible from the northbound trail. I knocked it down and recorded the coordinates. When I got back to the office, I pulled up both points on the topo map. They were 1.4 miles apart, both at approximately 8,800 feet, both offset about 30 yards west of the trail. If you drew a line between them, it ran almost perfectly north-south, parallel to the trail but on the uphill side. The line, if extended, would cross into the drainage where I'd heard the hum. That was the moment something shifted for me. Not dramatically, I didn't feel afraid or excited. I felt the particular kind of attention that comes from noticing a possible connection between things you'd been treating as separate. 2 cairns and a sound. 3 data points. Not enough to mean anything, but enough to make me pay attention differently the next time I was in that country. In October, the high trails started closing. Snow came early that year, a foot of wet, heavy stuff on the 14th that didn't melt above 9,000 feet. I was down in the office more, catching up on paperwork, when I found myself looking through old patrol reports. Not because Paul had asked me to, because I wanted to see if Tom Gately had mentioned cairns. The digital patrol reports went back to 2014. Before that, they were in filing cabinets in the back room, which Colleen maintained with the same fierce order she applied to everything. I searched the digital records first. Gately's reports from 2017 through 2019 were thorough. He'd been a detail-oriented ranger, the kind who recorded specific visitor counts by trailhead and noted when a particular blaze needed repainting. His 2 mentions of the hum were exactly as Colleen had described. Clinical, brief, filed under environmental observations. He did not mention cairns, but a ranger named Linda Paulson, who'd worked the district from 2009 to 2015, had. In a 2013 report, she noted removing a series of unauthorized rock cairns along the high bench west of the main trail, Little Goose Creek drainage. She'd removed 4. Her report described them as well-constructed, apparently old, and spaced at regular intervals. She recommended monitoring the section for continued unauthorized installations. There was no follow-up report addressing cairns. Either nobody went back to check, or the cairns weren't rebuilt after Paulson removed them. Except that I'd found 2, in what sounded like the same location, 9 years later. I mentioned the cairns to Paul in a hallway conversation. I told him I'd found the 2013 report from Paulson, and that I'd found similar structures in the same area. Paul's response was not unusual for a district ranger. He told me to remove any unauthorized structures per wilderness regulations and document the locations, which I'd already done. Then he said something that I noted at the time, but didn't fully think through until later. If you see those again next season, let me know before you remove them. I asked why. I want the coordinates plotted. If someone's building them repeatedly, that's a different conversation than someone building them once. This was reasonable. A recurring installation in wilderness could indicate a pattern of use that warranted investigation. A guide operating without a permit, a researcher marking study plots without authorization, or just a persistent hobbyist. Paul's request made administrative sense. But his face, when he said it, didn't look administrative. It looked like the parking lot conversation about the 2 a.m. practice. Like the next sentence had been edited out before it reached his mouth. Winter closed the high country entirely. I spent December through March on low-elevation work road surveys, boundary maintenance, timber sale prep on the east side slopes. I drove past the trailheads, where the summer felt distant, and watched the snow line settle lower each week. I didn't think about the cairns much. I thought about the hum occasionally, in the way you think about an interesting bird you saw once. Small mental bookmark, filed and waiting. In April 2023, I drove to Ashwarden to meet with the forest supervisor's office about the trail reroute. And while I was there, I used the archive access to look for Linda Paulson's contact information. She had retired in 2015, and the HR database had a forwarding address in Thermopolis, about 90 miles south. I didn't contact her. I want to be honest about that. I had no professional reason to call a retired ranger about cairns I'd already removed. What I had was a personal curiosity that I couldn't fully justify and didn't want to explain to Paul or Colleen. So I wrote down her address and put it in my wallet and went back to work. The summer of 2023 started normally. Jake Pruitt returned as a seasonal. Danny Montoya had taken a job with the Park Service and was replaced by a woman named Sarah Oren, who was sharp, organized, and complained less about the overnight patrols than anyone I'd worked with. By mid-June, the high trails were clear enough to start wilderness patrols, and I was back in the country I'd been thinking about all winter. On my first patrol of the season, I hiked the Little Goose Creek Trail to the bench where I'd found the cairns. Both locations were bare. No cairns. The granite outcrops where they'd stood showed no sign that anything had been stacked there, which made sense. I'd knocked them down and scattered the stones the previous fall. I continued the patrol north, past the second cairn location, and up toward the head of the drainage. The trail climbed into thinner timber subalpine fir, some white bark pine, the trees getting shorter and more wind-battered as the elevation increased. At around 9,500 feet, the trail crossed a rocky shelf and entered the upper basin, where the drainage opened into a broad alpine bowl with a ridge above and a chain of small tarns below. Cloud Peak was visible to the northwest, still heavy with snow. I stopped on the shelf to eat lunch and glassed the basin with binoculars. Across the bowl, maybe half a mile away on the opposite slope, something caught the light. A brief flash, like sun on glass or polished metal. It was there for a second, then gone. I watched for several minutes, but didn't see it again. Probably a quartz outcrop. The bighorns are full of granitic rock that reflects sunlight at certain angles. I noted it and continued my patrol. That night I camped at a site in the upper basin, at about 9,400 feet, near the largest of the tarns. The weather was perfect, clear, cold, still. I set up camp, cooked dinner, and sat on a rock watching the sky darken. The stars emerged in the particular way they do in the high mountains, when there's no moisture in the air, not gradually, but all at once, like a switch being thrown. At approximately 10:40 p.m., I heard the hum again. It was the same sound. Same character, same approximate interval, same resonant quality. But I was 1.5 miles north of where I'd heard it the previous summer, and 1,000 feet higher. The drainage below me was different. The acoustics were different. If this had been an Aeolian effect at the elbow, it shouldn't have been audible here. I got out of my tent and stood in the cold. The hum was there, steady, cycling. It seemed to come from everywhere in the basin, from the rock, from the water, from the air itself. I walked to the edge of the tarn. The water was black and still, and for a moment I thought I could see the surface trembling with each pulse of the sound. Tiny concentric ripples expanding from the center. But it was dark. And the mind can manufacture patterns in still water when you're standing alone at 9,000 feet, listening to a sound you can't explain. I went back to bed. I didn't sleep well. The hum continued for what I estimate was 3 hours. In the morning, I hiked to the spot where I'd seen the flash. It took 40 minutes to cross the basin and climb the opposite slope. I found the source easily. It was not a quartz outcrop. It was a cairn. The same construction as the ones I'd found below 5 flat stones, carefully stacked, but this one had something on top. A piece of flat glass, about 3 inches square, smooth-edged, placed in the shallow depression of the top stone, like a lens in a setting. It was the glass that had caught the sun. I stood there for a long time, looking at it. The cairn was on a shelf with a direct line of sight across the basin to the trail where I'd eaten lunch the day before. The glass, angled as it was, would throw a reflection toward anyone standing on that section of trail when the sun was in the south. Not randomly, deliberately. Someone had placed it to be seen from a specific point. I photographed the cairn from every angle. I bagged the piece of glass. And then I did something I'd never done before in my career. I did not knock the cairn down. I left it standing. I told myself it was because Paul had asked me to report recurring cairns before removing them. That was true. But it wasn't the whole reason. The whole reason was that I was standing at 9,500 feet in designated wilderness, looking at a piece of glass that had been cut to fit a specific stone, placed to signal a specific location, and maintained by someone who came back year after year. And I did not want to interrupt whatever conversation I had accidentally walked into the middle of. When I got back to the office 4 days later, I went straight to Paul's office and told him what I'd found. I laid out the coordinates, the photographs, the glass, and the connection to Paulson's 2013 report. Paul listened without interrupting. He looked at the photographs for a long time, He looked at the piece of glass in its evidence bag. Then he closed his office door, sat back down, and said, "I need to tell you about Ridgeline." Part 2. Ridgeline, Paul told me, was not a formal operation. It was not in any database or tracking system. It was a word that Linda Paulson had used in a memo she'd written to the previous district ranger in 2014. And it had stuck the way shorthand does when people need a name for something they don't want to describe every time they discuss it. Paul leaned forward in his chair and spoke the way people do when they've rehearsed something, without knowing they were rehearsing it. He told me that Paulson had spent her last 3 years on the district, quietly documenting what she believed was a sustained pattern of human activity in the upper Little Goose drainage and 2 adjacent drainages to the north. Not camping, not hiking, not poaching or unauthorized guiding. Something she couldn't categorize. The cairns were part of it. The cairns were the most visible part. Paulson had found and removed them multiple times between 2011 and 2014. Each time, they returned. Not immediately, sometimes months later, sometimes a full season. But they came back in the same locations, same construction, same 5-stone design. She'd mapped 12 positions across a span of about 4 miles, all on the west side of the main trail, all between 8,500 and 9,800 feet. She believed they were route markers, but not for any trail. They traced a line that ran parallel to the maintained trail but 30 to 50 yards uphill, along a natural bench system that connected the drainages without crossing the exposed ridgeline above. A shadow trail. That was the phrase Paulson had used in her memo. Someone had marked a route through the high country that avoided every section of maintained trail, every established campsite, and every point where a hiker on the main path would have a clear sight line to the bench above. Paul said the previous district ranger had read Paulson's memo, spoken with her privately, and concluded that the most likely explanation was an unauthorized outfitter, someone running backcountry trips off-book, using an unmarked route to avoid detection. This happened occasionally on western forests. A guide with local knowledge could operate for years without being caught if they stayed off the main trails and their clients kept quiet. The district ranger had asked law enforcement to increase patrols in the area during the 2014 and 2015 seasons. And Linda Paulson had retired in 2015 without the matter being resolved. Tom Gately picked it up, Paul said. Not officially, on his own. He found cairns in 2016 and mentioned them to me. I told him the same thing I told you: document and report. He did. He also heard the sound. Twice. That you know of. Tom heard it more than twice. He stopped reporting it because he didn't want it in his file every other week. I asked Paul what he meant by that. I mean, Tom heard it regularly. Every patrol in the upper drainage, June through September. He heard it after dark. Not every night, but often enough that he started adjusting his camp locations to see if distance changed it. It didn't. Or it did, but not the way he expected. He said it was louder at higher elevations, and it seemed to follow the line of the cairns. Paul paused. He looked at the piece of glass on his desk. Tom requested a transfer in January 2020. He gave the standard reasons. I didn't push. But the week before he left, he came into this office and shut the door, same as I'm doing now. And he told me that during his last season, he'd followed the bench route at night. I waited. He followed the cairn line north, off trail, after dark. He did it 3 times. He said the hum was present each time, and each time it was directional, it pulled north along the bench, strongest when he was moving and fading when he stopped. He said it wasn't a sound the way we'd normally categorize a sound. He said it felt more like a pressure differential, like walking alongside a moving column of air that had mass. Paul delivered this with no embellishment. He told it the way you repeat a co-worker's account of a vehicle accident factually, with a distance. The third time he did it, Paul said. He followed the bench about 2 miles past the last cairn he'd previously documented. He was above timberline. No moon. He said he was navigating by headlamp and GPS. At approximately 1:45 a.m., he came around a granite buttress and saw light below him in a side drainage. What kind of light? He described it as ambient. Not a beam, not a point source. A general illumination coming from the drainage floor like reflected moonlight, except there was no moon. He said it covered an area roughly 40 yards across. He watched it for about 15 minutes from above. He said it did not move, did not flicker, and did not appear to have a source. It was simply there, like the drainage floor was producing its own light. And then it stopped. He said it didn't fade. It was there, and then it wasn't, like someone had closed a door. He checked his watch. It was 2:12 a.m. He hiked back to his camp and never went up there again. Paul leaned back. That was November 2019. Tom transferred 2 months later. The 2 a.m. practice was already in place. Before any of this, it goes back at least to 2008. Probably earlier. I don't know who started it or what their specific reason was. But when Tom told me this, I stopped asking. I sat with that for a long time. The office was quiet. Through the wall, I could hear Colleen's printer running. "What do you think it is?" I asked. "I think there's a phenomenon in the upper drainages that multiple people have observed over more than a decade. And I think nobody has the expertise or the mandate to investigate it. And I think the cairns are related to it in a way I don't understand. I think someone, a person, a real human being has been navigating that country using the cairns and possibly using or studying whatever the phenomenon is. And I think the 2 a.m. practice exists because at some point, someone in this office decided that whatever is up there after 2 in the morning is not something they wanted their people walking into accidentally during a search. That's a significant thing to decide without documenting it." "Yes, it is." Paul opened his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. Inside was Paulson's original memo, 3 typed pages, with a hand-drawn map and a series of photographs she'd taken of cairns between 2011 and 2014. The photographs were printed on standard paper, slightly faded. The cairns looked exactly like the ones I'd found. 5 stones, flat, stable, built to last. "Linda left this with the district ranger," Paul said. "When he retired, it stayed in the desk. I inherited it. Tom saw it. Now you're seeing it." He let me read the memo. Paulson's prose was direct and unadorned. She described the cairns, their positions, their reappearance after removal. She described finding what she called travel sign along the bench route disturbed duff, overturned rocks, broken spider webs at face height, indicating that someone was walking the route regularly, probably at night, since she never encountered anyone during daytime patrols. She described a single night when she'd camped deliberately on the bench and heard the hum, which she logged as a subsonic or low-frequency periodic signal of indeterminate origin, perceived as much in the chest as in the ears. That sentence stayed with me. Perceived as much in the chest as in the ears. She was right. That was exactly how it felt. The memo's final paragraph recommended a formal investigation with acoustic monitoring equipment and law enforcement support. The recommendation had never been acted upon. At the bottom, in pen, someone, presumably the former district ranger, had written, "Discussed with LP monitoring informally. No current resources for dedicated survey." Paul let me take the folder. I spent 2 days going through it, cross-referencing Paulson's cairn positions with my own GPS points and with the topo maps. Her 12 cairns and my 3 occupied the same corridor. The 2 I'd found and removed on the lower bench were in positions she'd documented. The upper one with the glass was new. Either she'd never gone that high on the bench, or it hadn't been built yet when she was working the area. I plotted all 15 positions on a map. The line they described was remarkably consistent. It followed the natural bench system, maintaining elevation, curving with the terrain to stay on stable ground. Whoever had designed this route understood the landscape intimately. They knew where the footing was solid, where the bench widened enough to walk comfortably, where the timber provided cover. It was not a recreational path. It was a functional one, built by someone who needed to move through the high country efficiently and invisibly. I called Linda Paulson on a Saturday in July. I used my personal phone. I told her who I was and what I'd found, and I asked if she was willing to talk about it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Did Paul give you my file?" "Yes." Good. I was starting to think he'd thrown it away. We talked for an hour. Most of what she told me aligned with what Paul had relayed and what I'd read. But she added 2 things that weren't in the memo. The first was that during her final summer, 2014, she'd found a campsite on the bench route. Not a Forest Service site, not a recreational camp, but a place where someone had clearly spent time. No fire ring, no trash, no tent stakes. What she found was a slight rectangular depression in the duff, about the size of a sleeping bag, under a dense canopy of subalpine fir. And beside it, a flat stone that had been moved from somewhere else and placed like a seat or a work surface. She said it looked like someone had sat there many times, in the same position, over a long period. The duff was compressed in a way that suggested years of use. I sat down on the stone, she told me, just to see what they saw. And the view from that spot was straight down the drainage toward the east. You could see the main trail below. You could see the trailhead parking area. On a clear day, you could probably see the road. Whoever sat there could watch people come and go for miles. The second thing she told me was about the hum. I only heard it the once, she said. But I felt it other times. On warm days, in the afternoon, when I was on the bench route. I'd feel a vibration in my sternum. Not audible, not quite. Like standing next to a transformer, except there was nothing there. I had a colleague, a geologist, not Forest Service, and I described it to him without telling him the location. He said it sounded like a resonance effect, possibly geological. Some rock formations can vibrate at frequencies below human hearing when they're heated differentially by the sun. He called it thermoacoustic resonance. It's a real thing, documented in a few desert environments. Sandstone arches mostly. But this isn't sandstone. No, it's granite and metamorphic. And the effect I felt was strongest in the evening, not the afternoon. My friend said that contradicted the thermal hypothesis. He said if it was strongest as the rock was cooling, it might be some kind of stored energy release. But he'd never heard of that in this type of formation. I thanked her. Before she hung up, she said one more thing. "Aaron, the person on the bench, I never saw them. Tom never saw them. But they're real. The cairns don't build themselves, and someone cut that piece of glass. Whoever they are, they've been up there a long time, and they know the country better than we do. I don't think they're dangerous. But I think they know something about that drainage that we don't, and I think the cairns are how they use whatever that knowledge is." I didn't go back to the bench route until August. I'd spent the intervening weeks thinking about the situation more carefully than I usually think about anything on this job. The problem was this. I had clear evidence of unauthorized activity in designated wilderness. Cairns, a constructed route, an apparent long-term habitation site. That was enough to justify a law enforcement referral. But the activity was non-destructive. The structures were 5 stacked rocks that you'd walk past without noticing. And the habitation evidence was a compressed patch of duff and a relocated stone. No law enforcement officer in the region was going to prioritize that. And underlying the administrative question was the other one. The sound, the hum, the vibration that 3 rangers across 15 years had independently noticed in the same corridor, and that Tom Gately had followed to something he couldn't explain. I went back in mid-August, on a patrol that I'd structured to give myself a legitimate reason to spend a night on the bench route. I camped at the spot Paulson had described, the flat stone under the fir canopy. It took me 20 minutes to find it, even with her general directions, because the bench was wider than I expected and the timber was dense. But the stone was there, gray and smooth and slightly hollowed by use. And the depression in the duff beside it was still visible. Whoever sat here hadn't been here. Recently, the duff was starting to recover, a few seasons of needlefall softening the impression, but the sight was unmistakable. I sat on the stone. Paulson was right about the view. Through a gap in the fir, the drainage opened below me, and I could see the pale thread of the main trail switchbacking down toward the creek. Beyond it, the dark mass of the lower forest. Beyond that, miles of foothills descending toward the plains. On that clear afternoon, I could see the geometry of the roads near Buffalo, tiny and precise, and the faint haze of the town. I had the feeling of sitting in someone's living room without invitation. Not a threatening feeling, a private one. Someone had chosen this exact spot because it offered something they needed: the view, the concealment, the proximity to whatever was happening in the drainage, and they'd returned to it so many times that their body had worn a shape into the earth. I set up my camp nearby. I ate. I waited. The hum began at 9:52 p.m. It was different here. Not louder, not quieter, but more defined, as though I'd moved from the edge of the signal to the center of it. The cycling was clearer, a rise over roughly 4 seconds, a plateau of 2 or 3 seconds, then a decline over another 4. The period was consistent enough that I could predict each crest. I timed it with my watch. The interval varied between 9 and 12 seconds, averaging just over 10. At 11 p.m., I made a decision I'd been considering for weeks. I packed my headlamp and GPS and started walking north along the bench, following the cairn line. The route was easier to travel than I'd expected. The bench was solid underfoot, mostly granite slabs with pockets of thin soil supporting grass and low shrubs. The cairns appeared in my headlamp beam at regular intervals. I passed 4 in the first mile that I hadn't previously documented. Each one identical. 5 stones, flat, stable. The glass cairn was the exception. The others were plain stone. They functioned as navigation markers, and they worked. Without them, the bench was featureless in the dark. With them, it was a highway. The hum was continuous and, as Tom had reported, directional. It was strongest when I was moving north. When I stopped, it seemed to diffuse, losing its sense of source. When I moved, it tightened again, pulling me forward along the bench like a current I could walk alongside. I followed it for about an hour. The timber thinned as I gained elevation, and eventually I was above the last stunted fir, walking on open rock with the stars overhead and the dark bulk of the ridge to my left. The air was very cold. My breath condensed in my headlamp beam, The only sounds were my boots on rock, the rhythm of my breathing, and the hum. At 11:58 p.m., I came around a granite buttress, the same feature Tom had described, and looked down into the side drainage below. There was nothing there. The drainage was dark, empty, silent. Rock and shadow and the faint gleam of a snowfield at the head of the cirque. No light, no illumination, nothing. I stood for 20 minutes. The hum was fading. By 12:15, it was gone entirely. The silence that replaced it was absolute. No water, no wind, no insects at that elevation. Just the granite cooling under my boots and the stars rotating imperceptibly overhead. I hiked back to camp, arriving around 1:30 a.m. I slept poorly. In the morning, I struck camp and descended to the main trail and spent the hike out replaying Tom Gately's account. He'd seen light in the drainage at approximately 1:45 a.m., and it had vanished at 2:12. I'd arrived at 11:58 and seen nothing. The obvious difference was time. Tom had been there later. I did not go back at 2 in the morning. I want to be clear about that. The standing practice existed, and regardless of its undocumented origin, I was not prepared to violate it alone. In the Alpine, on a night when I'd already pushed further into this than any reasonable professional should. But I went back to Paul. I told him what I'd done. He listened. He didn't reprimand me, though he could have. I'd conducted what amounted to an unauthorized solo investigation at night in the wilderness, well outside my patrol plan. What he said was, "You didn't see it." No. Tom saw it on his third attempt, at different times. You think it's time-dependent. I think there's a window, Paul said. I think whatever happens in that drainage happens late. And I think the practice exists because someone figured that out before any of us. Who? Paul shook his head. He didn't know. We sat in his office. It was late August, the afternoon light coming through the window at the low angle that signals the turn of the season. Outside, someone was loading equipment into a truck. Aaron, Paul said, I've been the district ranger here for 7 years. In that time, I've had 3 rangers work the east side. All 3 of them found the cairns. 2 of them heard the hum. 1 of them saw something I can't explain. None of them got hurt. Whoever is up there building the cairns, sitting on that stone, walking that route, they've been doing it longer than I've been here, and they haven't caused harm. The phenomenon in the drainage, whatever it is, has not affected anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Except the 2 a.m. practice. The practice predates my tenure. It may predate the current understanding entirely. For all I know, it started because a district ranger 20 years ago had a bad feeling about night operations in that country and made a policy, and the rest filled in around it. Do you believe that? Paul was quiet. No, he said. I think someone saw what Tom saw, or something similar, and decided that keeping people out after a certain hour was simpler than explaining why. The season ended. Snow closed the high trails. I spent the winter with a folder on my desk at home, looking at the map with its 15 cairn positions, reading Paulson's memo, rereading my own notes. I contacted Tom Gately once through a mutual acquaintance at the Shoshone. He declined to talk. The message relayed back to me was polite but final. I said what I had to say to Paul. I'm done with it. In April 2024, I drove to Thermopolis and met Linda Paulson in person. She was 71, sharp-eyed, living alone in a small house with a yard full of rock specimens. We sat at her kitchen table, and I showed her my updated map. She studied it for a long time. You found the glass one, she said. You knew about it? No, but it makes sense. If you're navigating the bench in daylight, and you want to know exactly when you're crossing into the upper drainage. You'd want a signal you could see from the trail. The glass would do that. Who are they, Linda? She put the map down. I spent 4 years on that question. I checked permit records, outfitter registrations, research permits, grazing allotments, mineral claims. Nothing matched. I ran the idea of an uncontacted hermit past law enforcement. And they said unless someone reports a crime or a missing person, there's nothing to investigate. I talked to 2 ranchers whose allotments border the forest on the east side, and one of them, old man, been running cattle there since the 70s. Said his grandfather used to talk about the Watcher on the high bench. He said it like a place name, like it was a feature of the landscape. She let that sit. I don't think it's one person, she said. I think it's a practice. I think someone has been maintaining that route and those markers for a very long time, longer than the Forest Service has managed this land. And I think they're studying the same thing we noticed. The sound, the vibration, whatever happens in that drainage after dark. They're studying it, and the cairns are their instrument. And we keep knocking them down, and they keep building them back. I drove home from Thermopolis with the windows open and the Wyoming wind filling the cab. And I thought about a line of cairns running through the high country like vertebrae in a spine, and a sound that rose from the granite like breath, and a piece of glass placed on a stone to catch the sun at exactly the right angle to tell one person, approaching from one direction, that they had arrived. I still work the Powder River District. I still patrol the east side trails. The cairns are still there. I've stopped knocking them down. I documented my reasoning in a memo to Paul. That repeated removal has not deterred reconstruction, that the structures are minimally impactful, and that monitoring in place may yield more information than removal. Paul approved the memo without comment. I have not been back to the upper drainage after dark. I have not violated the 2 a.m. practice. Some nights in the summer, when I'm camped in the high country and the hum begins, I lie in my tent and time the intervals on my watch. And I wonder if somewhere on the bench above me, someone is sitting on that flat stone, watching the drainage, counting the same cycles I'm counting, and understanding something about the frequency or the timing or the light that 3 generations of rangers have noticed, and none of us have decoded. The rancher's grandfather called them the Watcher on the high bench. Singular. Linda thinks it's a practice. Tom thinks it's a phenomenon. Paul thinks it's a question that the district doesn't have the resources or the mandate to answer. I think the cairns are an invitation. I think they've always been an invitation. And I think the 2 a.m. practice exists not because the drainage is dangerous after 2, but because what happens there after 2 is something that someone, the watcher, the builder, whoever has been walking that route in the dark for longer than anyone can remember, does not want interrupted. The glass is still in an evidence bag in my desk drawer. On bright mornings, when the sun comes through the office window at the right angle, it throws a small square of light onto the wall above my computer. It moves as the sun moves. It tracks across the plaster like a slow finger pointing west. Toward the mountains, toward the bench, toward the drainage where the hum rises every summer from rock that should be silent. I watch it until it fades. Then I go back to work.